He was the kind of soldier who belonged to another century, shaped by the mud of the First World War, disciplined by staff colleges and decades of routine, a living link between Imperial Germany and the Nazi state. He wore the uniform of the old officer corps, spoke the language of duty and order, and for years he was counted among Hitler's most trusted commanders. And yet, at a moment when the fate of Germany hung in the balance, he turned away. Why did one of the regime's oldest and most respected field marshals break with the Führer he had once served? Gerd von Rundstedt, the name carried weight in the Wehrmacht. He was not a flamboyant strategist of the radio age or a charismatic propagandist. He represented the slow, methodical competence of a generation that believed war had rules and that professional judgment ought to matter. That reputation was both his shield and his burden. It earned him proximity to the center of power. It also made his later dissent sting more sharply than that of any young, marginal officer. To understand why von Rundstedt turned against Hitler, we must follow two tracks at once: the evolution of military reality on Europe's battlefields and the gradual corrosion of moral and political legitimacy within the regime. The early chapters are familiar: rapid victories, daring armored thrusts, a German army that seemed to validate its doctrine in lightning campaigns. For many senior officers, those victories produced confidence and, crucially, latitude. Commanders who delivered results were allowed a degree of operational freedom. Success conferred trust. Von Rundstedt benefited from that pattern. His career, dyed in the traditions of the old Prussian army, gave him credibility. It placed him squarely in a web of relationships that connected professional soldiers, political leaders, and the bureaucrats who shaped wartime logistics. But the latitude of victory contains its own danger. When an army wins, commanders expect decisions to be made on a basis of military judgment, where terrain, supply lines, communications, and timing are the dominant currencies. Under Hitler, political imperatives increasingly displaced those considerations. The leader's ideological priorities, his demand for personal loyalty, and his growing insistence on centrally managed solutions began to overwrite professional advice. Where once von Rundstedt and his peers had been consulted as equals, their counsel was often subordinated to directives issued from the top, framed more by politics than by the evolving tactical picture. This erosion of military autonomy did not happen overnight. It accumulated through a series of shocks and missteps. The war's expansion into multiple theaters stretched the Wehrmacht's logistics to breaking point. Armies long used to decisive engagements now faced attrition, supply crises, and the grinding attritional battles of the Eastern Front.
Stalingrad, above all, was not simply a battlefield defeat. It was a tectonic event in the Wehrmacht's collective judgment. 1 million men, whole formations, caught by encirclement and the absence of flexible withdrawal plans. The shock convinced many professional officers that the strategic premises on which they were operating were no longer valid. For von Rundstedt, as for others, the lesson was practical before it was moral. Hitler's rigidity had become an operational hazard. Orders to hold ground at all costs, to forego tactical retreats that could shorten fronts, and to prioritize symbolic stands over maneuverable defense meant men were fed to disasters that could have been limited with pragmatic withdrawals. This was not abstract criticism of ideology. It was a complaint about the simple mechanics of war: fuel, ammunition, rail capacity, weather, and the time it took to move whole divisions. When an army's lifeblood is denied by high command, commanders on the ground are forced into impossible choices. Alongside those strategic failures, a second strain was growing: knowledge, rumor, and the slow unfolding of moral reality. The Wehrmacht's relationship to the regime's crimes was complex and layered. Some officers saw the murder of civilians and mass atrocities from a distance. Others encountered evidence directly. The effect on professional judgment varied. For a commander like von Rundstedt, whose identity was tied to a conception of honorable military service, the revelation that the state's war aims were accompanied by systematic criminality created a dissonance that could not be dismissed as mere politics. The question shifted from tactical competence to the legitimacy of what he served. It is important to be precise here. The historical record for von Rundstedt's private reactions to specific crimes is not always complete. Some personal sentiments are indefinable in the archival record. What is documented is the broader pattern among senior commanders, increasing unease with the regime's methods and objectives. Officers who had once felt loyalty to the state found themselves in the position of serving an apparatus that was, in many respects, turning against the code they had sworn to uphold. For those steeped in military tradition, the oath to serve the German state did not automatically translate into unconditional support for policies that threatened both the nation and the law. As the strategic picture darkened, a new variable entered: the Allied plan to open a second front in the West. The prospect of an invasion across the English Channel forced a re-evaluation of defensive priorities. Germany's Atlantic coast was transformed into what the regime called the Atlantic Wall, a vast array of fortifications, gun emplacements, and obstacles intended to make any Allied landing prohibitively costly.
The wall, as a concept, had a rhetorical power that suited Hitler's appetite for monumental gestures. It allowed the propaganda machine to promise an impregnable barrier. In practice, however, the wall was a mosaic of concrete, manpower, and uncertainty. To be effective, it required a balanced distribution of forces, mobile reserves to react to landings, and commanders ready to exercise tactical flexibility, elements at odds with an ideology that prized symbolic defense over operational pragmatism. Intelligence and deception would complicate matters further. The Allies, learning hard lessons from early war setbacks, invested heavily in a strategy of misdirection. Operation Fortitude, a complex campaign of false formations, spoof signals, and double agents, sought to convince German high command that the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. To a military establishment already stretched thin and guided by flawed assumptions, such deception could be decisive. If reserves were misallocated and the invasion point misjudged, the result would not merely be a tactical surprise, but a strategic collapse. The very structures von Rundstedt trusted, maps, intelligence reports, frontline reports, were being manipulated in ways that exposed the Wehrmacht's vulnerabilities. What then did this mean for a senior commander whose professional duty was to prepare for and repel invasion? It meant making hard calls under conditions of incomplete information, political interference, and limited resources. It meant confronting the possibility that Hitler's decisions, his refusal to allow prudent withdrawals, his distrust of his own generals, his insistence on personally micromanaging deployments, could doom the defensive effort before it truly began. We can see in archival telegrams and staff notes from the period a pattern of growing frustration at the command level. Officers complained about delayed rail movements, shortages of fuel, and the piecemeal distribution of armored divisions. They warned that static coastal fortifications without the backup of mobile armored reserves were a brittle defense. Where these specific documents address von Rundstedt directly, the record can be uneven. Some dispatches attribute firm professional advice to him, while other details about his private conversations and exact orders are indefinite. What is clear, however, is the tenor of the objections circulating through the high command. The war was shifting from rapid maneuver to grinding attrition, and central control was not providing the adjustments necessary for the new reality. This combination, strategic strain plus moral unease, created the environment in which von Rundstedt's break with Hitler would become possible. But a general does not repudiate the leader of his state lightly. The officer's code, the oath to the Führer, the social fabric of the officer corps, and the personal risks involved in open dissent all created formidable barriers to action. For a man of von Rundstedt's background, any step toward opposing Hitler required a calculus that weighed legality, loyalty, and consequences. There were, broadly speaking, three possible pathways open to a disaffected senior officer in Nazi Germany. One was silent resignation, practice dissent in private, try to mitigate harm from within, and exit the stage without open confrontation. Another was direct collaboration with conspirators who sought to remove Hitler by force, assassination or coup, a path that many younger officers and some members of the Abwehr and civilian elites pursued. The third was public, legalistic opposition, to argue within the institutions of the state for a political solution, negotiated armistice, or leadership change in accordance with legal frameworks. Each route carried its own moral and operational implications. The historical evidence suggests that von Rundstedt's inclination was toward the legal political route and away from assassination, although for precise statements about his private stance, the record is indefinitive in several respects. This disposition was not unique to von Rundstedt. Among the old guard, the idea of murdering the head of state, even one whom they regarded as disastrously misguided, clashed with cultural notions of honor and legality. Many senior officers believed that a post-Hitler Germany needed to preserve some semblance of constitutional continuity and legitimacy.
violent seizures of power antithetical to their conception of statecraft. Moreover, assassination does not eliminate the problem of governance. Whoever took power after the deed would have to manage an exhausted country, negotiate with the Allies, and ensure order in a fragile situation. For men who prized order over chaos, the prospect of an extra-legal change of regime could appear worse than the continuation of ruin under Hitler's command. Whether von Rundstedt explicitly articulated such a calculus in memoranda or private conversations is indefinitive in parts of the record, but the broader intellectual climate in which he operated strongly favored legalistic solutions and strategic realism over conspiratorial violence. The months leading to the summer of 1944 hardened these tensions. Allied air superiority, the drain of the Eastern Front, and the cumulative effect of lost resources turned Germany's strategic position from precarious to perilous. The Allied deception campaign did its work. On a foggy June morning in Normandy, Allied soldiers and paratroopers began landing on beaches that the German defense had not fully anticipated. Commanders at all levels scrambled.
Field reports streamed in, often contradictory. Communications were jammed. Decisions had to be made in a compressed time frame that left no room for the kind of deliberation von Rundstedt and his peers preferred. We should be careful here about what can be attributed to von Rundstedt personally. Specific operational orders, precise movements of panzer divisions, and the timing of any individual general's countermanding instructions are sometimes attributed in varying sources. In many instances, the documentation is complex or fragmented. For that reason, where the record does not give a clear, direct line of action by von Rundstedt, we will treat the detail as indefinitive. What does emerge, however, is a credible pattern. Top commanders warned of the need for mobile reserves. They criticized the overemphasis on fixed coastal defenses without adequate reaction forces, and they feared that Hitler's insistence on holding the ground at all costs would blunt the army's ability to respond flexibly to invasion. As the Allied landings intensified, the High Command's response was hamstrung by more than fog and confusion. It was hamstrung by mistrust. Mistrust between Hitler and his generals and between competing arms of the Nazi state. Hitler's willingness to penalize commanders he deemed defeatist had created a culture in which initiative that contradicted his expressed intentions risked not only career suicide, but physical peril. In that climate, the standard operating procedures of a professional army, delegated authority, rapid decision-making at appropriate levels, and the freedom to trade space for time when prudent were undermined. The consequence was not only tactical inertia, it was a moral crisis for men who saw their professional recommendations ignored in favor of political platitude. It is tempting to reduce von Rundstedt's break to a single dramatic moment, a lightning flash of conscience, or a visible argument in a conference. The historical record resists such neatness. His estrangement from Hitler appears as a slow accretion of failures, a mounting sense that continued obedience would worsen Germany's situation rather than save it. Yet the invasion of Normandy served as a catalytic moment. It crystallized the consequences of earlier choices, the difficulty of rapidly shifting forces across the front, the misplacement of armored reserves, and the fragility of fixed defensive lines. In short order, the preconditions for a reckoning were in place. The command that had once trusted von Rundstedt's judgment found itself unable or unwilling to heed it. The leader who had courted loyalty now punished candor. Even inside these constraints, high-level officers attempted to influence policy. There were memoranda, informal consultations, and private warnings issued up the chain, documents that historians have used to reconstruct the growing rift.
Some of these records attribute to von Rundstedt a tone of blunt professionalism, warnings couched in the language of practicality rather than moral outrage. He was, in essence, insisting on the fundamentals of military art, the necessity of mobile reserves, the proper allocation of supply resources, and the willingness to withdraw to positions where a defense could be sustained. When those recommendations were ignored, the strategic consequences were immediate. The moral dimension of his break, however, cannot be discounted. For a professional soldier, the choice to resist a leader's orders has to be justified not only by a projection of military success, but by a conviction that the orders themselves are unlawful or ruinous. In von Rundstedt's case, the sense that Hitler's directives were not simply mistaken, but potentially catastrophic for Germany's survival, reframed the debate from tactical dissent to national necessity. That is the core of the real reason frame. It was not a single moral epiphany, nor a personal betrayal, but a convergence of practical ruin and ethical outrage that made continued obedience intolerable. Still, we must underline what remains uncertain. The archive does not give us a play-by-play of von Rundstedt's inner deliberations. Many personal letters, private conversations, and intimate attestations either have not survived, are redacted, or are indefinitive. Scholars infer motives from patterns of orders, from public exchanges with Hitler, and from the general's public and semi-public statements. In places where the documentation is thin, responsible narration must acknowledge that historians infer rather than assert. So far, the narrative thread is clear. An officer steeped in the old military culture, given latitude by early success, confronted by a war that no longer responded to conventional remedies, faced with a leader whose political imperatives outweighed professional judgment, found himself increasingly alienated. The Normandy invasion crystallized this alienation. Yet the story at this point is not finished. The turning away required a decision. How to oppose, by what means, and to what end? Would von Rundstedt align himself with conspirators who favored violent overthrow? Would he pursue legalistic, institutional pressure to remove Hitler from command? Or would he retreat into private resignation and moral protest without actionable consequence? Answering that question requires us to look closer at the institutional and personal constraints that shaped his options. It also requires acknowledging the reactions of the regime itself, how it responded to dissent within its own ranks, and at what cost. In the coming episodes, we will examine the nature of the options open to von Rundstedt, the networks of officers who debated the possibility of removing Hitler, and the internal legal and moral arguments that shaped their choices.
We will trace with care the documents and eyewitness reports that illuminate his stance. For now, it is enough to recognize that what pushed von Rundstedt away from Hitler was not a single betrayal by the leader or an isolated act of conscience, but the slow accumulation of strategic evidence and moral realization that continued obedience would, in effect, be a betrayal of the country he swore to defend. If this line of inquiry matters to you, and if you want to follow the evidence as historians have reconstructed it, stay with us. There is more to the story: the private councils, the tensions in the high command, the July conspirators and their arguments, and the regime's ruthless response. Each of these elements deepens our understanding of why an old field marshal, steeped in duty, ultimately decided that his allegiance to Germany required turning away from the man who claimed to lead it. Where the first fractures had begun with discarded advice and ignored logistics, the second phase of the drama opened in rooms that were supposed to protect the state: staff headquarters, war rooms, and the Führer's private offices. There, professional opinion collided with ideological doctrine and personal distrust. The Wehrmacht's staff structure, its divisions of planning, intelligence, and logistics, had become a battlefield of its own. Reports from the front told one story. Directives from Berlin told another. The higher one climbed in the chain of command, the more acute the contradiction became. Some senior officers attempted to translate professional frustration into formal requests: proposals to withdraw forces to more defensible lines, suggestions to consolidate armored reserves in positions that allowed rapid counterattack, and plans to reroute supplies to threatened sectors. Those proposals ran smack into a command culture that increasingly equated withdrawal with defeatism, that viewed any talk of compromise with the Allies as treasonous, and that preferred symbolic stands to flexible defense. In that climate, the everyday tasks of military planning, calculating tonnage of supplies, estimating rail capacities, assigning fuel to armored units, took on political meaning. A recommendation to concede ground could be read as a political betrayal. For officer corps men like von Rundstedt, this repoliticization of military planning was intolerable. It replaced technical judgment with ideological posturing at the cost of lives and strategic coherence. Behind the closed doors, the debate over what to do next intensified. A small circle of generals and staff officers circulated papers analyzing the bleak arithmetic of resources: how many divisions could be supported, where fuel shortages would force bottlenecks, and which sectors could be defended without sacrificing mobility. They asked hard questions of the regime's political leadership. If the war could not be won, what was the responsible course? Cling to a delusional hope that would destroy Germany, or seek a negotiated end that might preserve some national institutions? These calculations were, for many officers, inseparable from a moral assessment. If Germany's defeat seemed likely, then prolonging a futile fight would not only destroy cities and armies, but also ensure the collapse of civil order and the sufferings of millions. The ethical imperative for some commanders, therefore, was to seek an exit that minimized harm. Whether that meant negotiating with the Western allies, seeking armistice terms, or pressuring the political leadership to change course was contested. For von Rundstedt, whose personal views on assassination are in parts of the record indefinitive, the preferred route appears to have been an institutional one, to leverage his standing, his reputation, and the weight of the officer corps to press for measures that could halt the ruin. Whether such institutional pressure could have succeeded without radical action is precisely the kind of question historians still debate. We should be clear-eyed about the obstacles. First, the Nazi regime had merged the instruments of state with the instruments of party. Removing Hitler from power was not the same as replacing a prime minister in a parliamentary democracy. Hitler embodied the regime's legitimacy in a way that made legalistic removal exceedingly difficult. Second, the Allies were demanding unconditional surrender. The window for negotiated armistice shrank as the war progressed. Third, the internal security apparatus, the SS, the Gestapo, and the political leadership had demonstrated a willingness to detect and punish dissent swiftly. The cost of being branded defeatist ranged from dismissal to arrest and, in the worst cases, execution. That reality conditioned the choices available to any officer contemplating opposition. Still, the moral argument persisted among a minority of senior officers that their first loyalty was to the German nation, not to a leader whose decisions were steering the country into ruin. That argument reframed the oath. The oath was to the constitutionally recognized head of state, yet had the head of state converted the apparatus into an instrument of criminality and strategic self-destruction, some believed the higher duty could be to preserve the nation itself. For von Rundstedt and others, this was not an easy intellectual turn. It demanded abandoning a simplistic conception of loyalty and embracing a more complex and risky responsibility. At the same time, the machinery of repression tightened. The regime's intolerance for dissent extended to the military. Officers who aired public critiques were labeled defeatist and subject to investigation. The space for public debate shrank.
In such an environment, influence had to be exerted through networks, discreet memos, and private counsels. That is where von Rundstedt's reputation mattered most. A figure of his stature could lend weight to proposals and could persuade wavering colleagues. But reputation was also a double-edged sword. The regime took special note when its most prominent servants faltered. Public dissent from a name like von Rundstedt would be politically explosive, making a moderating voice simultaneously powerful and vulnerable. As summer gave way to autumn in 1944, the scale of the dilemma crystallized. The Eastern Front was collapsing under Soviet assaults, the Western Front had been breached, and the internal economy of the Reich was under increasing strain. For von Rundstedt, each new contingency underscored the same conclusion: the current course was unsustainable. But arriving at that conclusion is not the same as taking action. The calculus of risk, for self, for family, for colleagues, and for the nation, required deliberation. The networks with which he might act had to be assessed: who could be trusted, what could be achieved, and what would follow. Here again, the evidence about his private conversations is mixed. We possess some testimonies from staff officers and a handful of contemporary reports that indicate von Rundstedt's shared professional warnings and private frustrations with colleagues. How much he discussed concrete plans for political change, whether by legal means or otherwise, remains undefined in many archival traces. What historians can say with reasonable confidence is that he was part of an officer milieu that increasingly saw Hitler as an obstacle to responsible command and that sought ways to reduce the damage the regime was causing. How far that milieu was willing to go, and von Rundstedt's precise role within it, are matters of careful reconstruction rather than dramatic certainty. This is where the moral ambiguity of the story takes center stage. The image of an old field marshal turning against the Führer can be easily romanticized into a tidy narrative of principled heroism, but the truth is more complex and morally messy. The decision to oppose Hitler at that point in the war involved factors both noble and pragmatic: a genuine desire to save lives and avoid total ruin, an institutional insistence on professional standards, and a fear of the long-term consequences for Germany's political order. It was not necessarily an act of disinterested moral purity. For many officers, defending the nation also meant preserving the army's honor, protecting social order, and maintaining the legacy of the officer class. Those motives often intertwined with humanitarian concerns, producing a mixed calculus that historians must parse with care.
There was also the specter of the July conspirators, the network of officers, civil servants, and aristocrats who, bereft of other options, attempted to remove Hitler by violent means on July 20, 1944. Their plot, its motivations, and its aftermath have been exhaustively studied. Some within the officer corps sympathized with elements of the plot. Others condemned the assassination attempt as fundamentally illegitimate. Von Rundstedt's precise relationship to that conspiracy is in parts indefinito. He was not executed for participation, and the record suggests he maintained a distance from direct involvement. But the nuances of his stance require painstaking examination of memos and testimonies that we will explore in subsequent segments. As the months progressed, the regime's retaliation became more draconian. The failure of the July plot unleashed waves of arrests, trials, and executions. The message was clear: dissent would be met with ruthless suppression. The purges reached into the army, where officers suspected of disloyalty were removed or worse. Under such conditions, even those convinced of the need for action had to weigh whether their interventions would result in constructive change or simply in a violent crackdown that would further accelerate Germany's ruin. At this juncture, von Rundstedt's options narrowed. If he wished to oppose Hitler, he had to decide whether to continue to press for institutional pressure, to use his rank, reputation, and connections to force a political reorientation, or to turn his back entirely and withdraw from active service. Either choice would carry consequences. To press might mean personal peril. To withdraw might make him complicit by omission. The historical interplay between these choices would define his later legacy. We pause this arc here because the decisions that followed were not instantaneous. They were the product of meetings, memos, and human conversations in which motives were negotiated, risks calculated, and moral lines drawn. The next phase of the story will follow those conversations into specific rooms: the war rooms where von Rundstedt and his peers weighed options, the Berlin offices where Hitler and his inner circle deliberated, and the private households where families confronted the possibilities of arrest and retribution. We will look closely at the documents that bear on von Rundstedt Azüchen, separating what is well attested from what remains uncertain or indefinito. Only then can we fairly answer the central question: what, in concrete terms, made von Rundstedt turn against Hitler? What is already clear is this: his turning was not a simple betrayal of duty, nor was it an act of personal pique. It was the culmination of strategic realism confronting ideological stubbornness, moral unease confronting criminality, and an officer's duty confronting a leader's ruinous decisions.
The rest of the story is found in the choices he made next, choices that would determine his fate and, in part, the fate of the nation he sought to serve. What followed was not a single dramatic rupture, but a series of gatherings, memos, and private conversations in which the old soldier weighed peril against principle and reputation against duty. The rooms where those exchanges took place, staff offices, dimly lit war rooms, private studies, were the same spaces where the Wehrmacht's professional identity was being redefined under pressure. For von Rundstedt, the question was less about personal survival and more about whether continued obedience would amount to an act of self-betrayal, a professional compelled to execute orders that, by any sober calculation, would hasten national ruin. In those months, the practical case against the course set by Hitler grew more urgent. Staff papers circulated that reduced strategy to arithmetic: divisions available, fuel delivered, railheads functioning, time needed to shift armored formations. The calculus was unforgiving. The Eastern Front alone devoured men and material at a rate that undermined any realistic possibility of sustaining two full-scale theaters without either a drastic reallocation of resources or a strategic rethink. Those who had spent careers learning to balance supply with maneuver could see how the war's mechanics had been systematically distorted by politics. Von Rundstedt and his peers raised the same set of objections in different places. The army needed freedom to trade space for time. It needed mobile reserves positioned to counter landings. It needed the authority to withdraw from untenable positions without fear of reprisal. Those objections were not abstract. They were transmitted in official memoranda, in urgent telegrams, and in blunt oral reports to the Führer's environment. Some documents, frank staff notes, and what appear to be after-action summaries, speak of critical shortages and the impossibility of maintaining current lines under present directives. Where the record attributes particular phrasing to von Rundstedt, the documentation is sometimes precise. In other cases, the papers reflect a consensus of skepticism among senior officers rather than a single man's authored plea. For portions of von Rundstedt's private counsel, his letters, informal conversations, and internal reactions, the archival trail is indefinito. Historians therefore build their judgments from the pattern of recorded orders, the timing of his interventions, and testimony from contemporaries who described him as a blunt, professional voice in a chorus losing patience. The moral component of the break with Hitler advanced alongside the strategic one.
Knowledge, half corroborated, then increasingly confirmed, of the regime's crimes in occupied territories complicated the calculus.
For professional soldiers who had bound their identity to a certain code of conduct in warfare, knowing that the state's aims were being pursued through systematic brutality generated dissonance. Here again, the record is mixed. The extent to which von Rundstedt saw or acknowledged particular atrocities in private correspondence is indefinito. What is clearer are the broader effects. The Wehrmacht's association with criminal policies eroded the ethical foundation many officers had used to justify obedience. When military orders no longer served an honorable conception of national defense, but became instruments of oppression, the line between duty and complicity blurred. The tactical crisis and moral unease converged dramatically when the Allies opened their second front. Normandy was not only a battlefield, it was a test of institutional competence and of the regime's willingness to accept inconvenient professional advice. Allied deception, Operation Fortitude, had persuaded German high command that the main invasion might occur elsewhere. That misdirection, combined with Hitler's penchant for micromanagement and his declared unwillingness to permit strategic withdrawals, produced a case study in the costs of politicized command. The Atlantic Wall, grand in propaganda, was often impotent in practice because it lacked the requisite mobile reserves to exploit openings or blunt enemy thrusts. The result was not merely battlefield setbacks, but a profound erosion of the trust that renders military hierarchies functional. The Normandy landings crystallized the fissure. As reports flooded in, commanders expected rapid delegation, to use armored formations where needed, to shift forces without waiting for orders that might never arrive. What they often got instead were rigid directives that reflected fear of political reproach more than an assessment of military reality. In the aftermath, high-level staff exchanges reveal frustration, even fury. Again, when specific operational decisions are attributed to von Rundstedt, the documentary record varies in precision. Some orders bear his imprint, others do not, and a number of contested attributions must be treated as indefinito. This ambiguity, though, does not obscure the larger fact. The officer corps perceived a systemic problem, an inflexible political center that resisted the kinds of adjustments essential for defense. That perception fed the moral argument. The choice facing von Rundstedt and men like him was framed in terms that combined prudence and conscience, obey orders that would sow destruction, or resist orders that would preserve what remained of the nation. For men whose social identity depended on honor, legality, and the chain of command, the leap from professional objection to political intervention was fraught. There were three broad options, roughly speaking. One was to remain silent while attempting to mitigate damage from within, a path many took.
Another was to ally with conspirators prepared to remove Hitler by force, an option that the July 20 plotters pursued. The third was to use institutional influence to push for a legalistic realignment, removal through state mechanisms, or pressure toward negotiated terms with the Allies. For von Rundstedt, the record suggests a preference for institutional pathways. Whether he expressed absolute moral opposition to assassination is indefinitive in parts of the archive. What is evident is his adherence to a legalistic frame common among the old guard. Assassination violated their conception of statecraft and could precipitate chaos. They feared that violent overthrow might replace one set of catastrophes with another. The July 20 plot demonstrated both the desperation within parts of the German elite and the limits of conspiratorial action in a state where the security apparatus had been tightly fused with party power. When the bomb in Hitler's conference room failed to achieve its political purpose, the regime's machinery reacted with merciless swiftness. Arrests, show trials, and executions followed. The Sicherheitsdienst, the Gestapo, and the People's Court moved to crush networks associated with dissent. In response, the Wehrmacht was purged of officers suspected of sympathy with the conspirators. This purge served two functions. It removed opponents and intimidated those who might have contemplated institutional alternatives. For a figure like von Rundstedt, whose public resignation from the political orbit would have been an enormous symbolic loss to the regime, open endorsement of the conspirators would have invited immediate and lethal reprisal. Cautious distance, by contrast, allowed him some operational latitude even as his influence waned. The immediate consequences for von Rundstedt's own career are in some respects less important than the signal they sent. When the regime marked senior officers as suspect, it demonstrated that dissent of any decisive form would be crushed. Personal risk increased for anyone contemplating legalistic pressure. The options narrow further when one factors in the international landscape. By mid-1944, there was little hope of a negotiated settlement on terms acceptable to an intact German state. The Allies' position, publicly unconditional surrender, meant that any internal attempt to remove Hitler had to reckon with the reality that the victor's terms would be severe.
For officers committed to preserving institutions, that reality complicated any plan promising a soft landing for Germany. The implication was stark. Removing Hitler might not preserve the order the Old Guard sought to save. Faced with this spectrum of constrained choices, von Rundstedt took steps consistent with a professional who believed in preserving the nation through institutional means.
The specific content of his private counsel, minute-by-minute memos, explicit lines of correspondence with Allied intermediaries, or the precise threshold at which he judged assassination an unacceptable tool, are in parts indefinito. What historians can say, with reasonable confidence, is that he favored approaches that preserved legality and order. He urged, where he could, for the allocation of mobile reserves and for operational flexibility. He used his standing to press colleagues in the high command to consider the long-term survival of the state. Those interventions were not neutral acts of careerism. They were framed as efforts to avoid terminal ruin. The regime's response to such interventions was predictable: marginalize, discredit, or remove the dissenter. Officers who pressed for what looked like pragmatic realism were branded defeatist, a label that could lead to the loss of command, to arrest, or worse. The existence of these sanctions reshaped the incentives for actors in the high command. Many who might privately agree with von Rundstedt chose silence or half measures simply because the cost of exposure was too high, not only to themselves but also to their families and dependents. That reality complicates any simple moral narrative of courageous resistance. The calculus of action was lived and costly. The price for opposing Hitler in a concrete public way could be life. Beyond the immediate personal risk, tactical constraints limited what even a coalition of senior officers could accomplish. The regime had built parallel power structures, the SS, the party, and loyalist political networks that would not readily accept a military-led reordering. Even if the Wehrmacht's senior leadership had achieved consensus in favor of ousting Hitler, the practicalities of seizing control of the state apparatus, managing internal security, and dealing with occupied territories posed daunting barriers. The expectation that a well-intentioned officer corps could smoothly transition the state to a more stable arrangement underestimated the centrifugal forces unleashed by years of regime consolidation. Where, then, does von Rundstedt's turning away become a discrete action rather than an ongoing posture of resistance? The break is best understood not as a single political act, but as a cumulative withdrawal of unquestioned obedience. He used his authority to protect what he could, to contest orders he judged strategically ruinous, and to articulate publicly and privately the same theme: Germany's survival required a change of course. Those moves carry both moral and practical weight. In the language of constitutionalism, he tried to bring professional expertise back into the governance of the war. In the language of citizenship, he accepted the risk of opposing a leader whose policy choices had become catastrophic. When the regime retaliated, it did so with a mixture of legalistic theater and raw coercion.
The People's Court and the Gestapo enacted reprisals against military men and civilians linked to dissenting networks. Administrative measures stripped ranks and privileges from suspected figures. A climate of surveillance and denunciation spread. For those who had associated their identity with the old order, the consequences were not merely professional indignities, but existential threats. In that moment, von Rundstedt's decision to press for institutional pressure rather than endorse violent overthrow reflected both his values and an assessment of what could actually be achieved without triggering a rupture that would destroy the social fabric he sought to protect. The war continued its grim attrition. The Soviet advances, the Allied push in the West, and the collapse of Germany's logistical foundations produced a cascade of structural failures. In the end, the regime's fate was sealed by the combined weight of military defeats and internal disintegration. For von Rundstedt, as for many of his peers, the judgment of history would hinge less on a single act of defiance and more on the extent to which he attempted, within the narrow space available, to steer the nation away from annihilation. That attempt, though flawed and incomplete, was driven by the same practical-minded calculations that had characterized his long career: preserve what could be preserved, minimize needless loss, and restore a civic order capable of surviving the war's end. Post-war reckonings would treat von Rundstedt with the ambivalence reserved for many senior Reich officers. Some contemporaries and later commentators saw in his resistance a belated, if reluctant, break with tyranny. Others pointed out his earlier accommodation to the regime and asked whether his late dissent carried sufficient moral clarity. The archival picture remains complex. Various testimonies and interrogations conducted by Allied authorities after the war capture a man who emphasized professional duty and who tried to situate his choices within a framework of legality and national preservation. Yet other documents and critics remind us that being a conservative professional Pentecostal to the old military culture included toleration of the regime's earlier excesses, whether out of careerism, resignation, or loyalty to the state.
Parsing these threads requires careful attention to evidence, a refusal to tidy contradictions into neat verdicts, and a recognition that human motives are often mixed. So what, finally, is the real reason he turned?
The answer is not a single motive, but a compound causality. First, strategic realism, the incontrovertible fact that continuing on Hitler's path would lead to military collapse that could not be repaired by slogans or symbolic defenses. Second, moral revulsion, an increasing discomfort with the regime's criminal methods that made continued service ethically untenable for some. And third, patriotic duty, a conviction that loyalty to the nation required resisting orders and policies seen as suicidal, even at personal cost. These elements reinforced one another. Strategic facts sharpened moral concerns informed strategic judgments. Patriotic duty supplied the language and institution sense that justified opposition. It is crucial to reiterate the limits of what we can say about the man's private thoughts. Many intimate conversations and personal documents are indefinitive in the surviving record. Historians therefore rely on a mosaic of memos, staff reports, contemporaneous testimony, and the observable pattern of actions. From that mosaic emerges a portrait of a career officer whose break with Hitler was governed by professional assessment and pragmatic patriotism, rather than by a sudden conversion to democratic principle. That nuance matters. It reminds us that resistance can arise from a variety of motives, not only from abstract virtue, but from a practical determination to prevent ruin. The tragedy at the center of this story is double. First, that a state could become so fused with an ideology and a single personality that professional expertise lost its authority. Second, that the narrow corridor available for lawful correction, the space for institutional pressure, negotiation, or orderly change, had largely closed by the time many senior officers concluded that a change was necessary. That closure is partly why the crisis culminated in desperate conspiracies and savage reprisals, rather than in a managed political transition. There are lessons in this for military ethics and political life beyond the specific history. One is that professional judgment matters, and that politicizing military command can produce catastrophic consequences. Another is that the legitimacy of institutions depends on structures of accountability and on the ability to correct course before catastrophic momentum builds. Finally, there is a sobering recognition that moral clarity frequently arrives late, and that the cost of delayed resistance can be measured in lives and in destroyed communities. When we place von Rundstedt into this broader frame, his turning away from Hitler reads less like an act of melodramatic betrayal and more like the final exercise of a professional conscience reacting to an overdue strategic verdict. He stopped trusting the central political decisions that governed the war. He concluded, as other senior officers did, that continuing to execute those decisions would make him complicit in the nation's destruction.
The moral judgment is not without blemish. It is mixed with institutional self-concern and bounded by the realpolitik of an increasingly hopeless theater. But it is also informed by a genuine attempt, however belated, to steer the country away from annihilation. What ultimately happened to him and to those who stood in the officer circles with him is part of the larger story of collapse and accountability. The regime punished dissent ruthlessly. Many conspirators and sympathizers paid with their lives or with long deprivation. Others, like von Rundstedt, survived into the post-war moment to face interrogation, historical scrutiny, and the burden of public memory. Whether the choices they made were sufficient, or whether earlier courage would have altered the outcome, remains the subject of legitimate debate among scholars. In the end, the real reason he turned against Hitler embodied the tragic intersection of strategy, ethics, and duty. It was a professional break rooted in the conviction that continuing to obey spelled ruin for the nation he had sworn to serve. It was also a moral response to a system whose criminality had become increasingly impossible to ignore. And finally, it was an act shaped by the institutional mindset of an officer class that preferred legal and orderly solutions to violent upheaval. That mixture, hard-headed realism, moral unease, and conservative patriotism, explains much of the arc of his descent. The story resists tidy heroics. It resists simple condemnations and facile vindications. It asks us instead to sit with the uncomfortable truth that every moment of resistance in an authoritarian apparatus carries costs and ambiguities.
Von Rundstedt's turn, when seen through the long lens of strategic consequence and moral reckoning, becomes a case study in how professional integrity can collide with political evil, and how that collision can produce both clarity and compromise. If you want to dig deeper into the documents, the telegrams, and the staff memoranda that scholars have used to reconstruct these judgments, you'll find source links in the description accompanying this video. There, you can consult edited collections of wartime communications, transcripts of post-war interrogations, and the most careful archival studies that separate the well-attested from the indefinitive. Reflecting on this history matters, conscience, and the responsibilities of military professionals in the face of criminal regimes. If this examination resonated with you, check the links below for primary sources and recommended reading, and subscribe for more detailed explorations of pivotal wartime decisions and the men who made them.